So for this week on CyberSchool, we're going to be going over school notification solutions. In the past couple of weeks, we've covered a lot of the different products and how they integrate, and we've touched on integrating the products with at least one provider so far. So I figured it would be good to talk about different applications and use cases for our products. Now that after attending several of these different CyberSchool sessions, you have an idea of how these products work, but now we can talk a little bit more about actually applying them. And the particular use case that we'll be going over this week is a school notification or a school paging solution. We've got a lot of different products that can tie into it, and there's a lot of different options when you go for a school-based notification or a paging system. There's a lot of different options that you can take when you're moving towards doing a particular paging solution. So the main three options are going to be IP to analog, kind of your bare bones solution. Just take what we have today and make it work tomorrow. Then you've got your hybrid-based solution where you've got analog in one area and you want to, say expand, say part of that analog system doesn't work, or you've got some new facilities that you're building and you want those to be more IP-based, and that would be kind of a hybrid system where you've got both IP to analog and a regular IP-based solution, kind of the best of both worlds. And then for completely new deployments, you could potentially deal with a wholly IP-based solution. So there's a lot of different options when you're tying in a different paging system here, and I wanted to kind of go over all of the three different options that we have available. So for IP to analog paging, just to kind of as a basis, you get to utilize the existing analog paging hardware that's already there. In the times that I've talked to different schools, either doing technical pre-sales or at different trade shows, schools really invested in a paging system in the early 2000s. I think there was a big push to probably move away from what they got, back in the 80s or the 70s, and they wanted to move towards a new system. And with SIP in its kind of fledgling days back then, a lot of providers went for either just a standard analog system, or they went for a proprietary digital system, or even some people going for a VoIP system. So there's really a mix of hardware that's available out there in terms of an analog paging solution that these different schools might have. And these investments are, especially when you're dealing with, copper wires and analog speakers, if the speakers don't get damaged, those things will work for years. You could really get, 20, 30 years out of a good set of speakers if you take care of them and they don't get damaged. So you can really utilize and continue to take advantage of that prior investment in a paging system, assuming it still works and it's compatible with new VoIP equipment that you can use. One of the nice things with going with an IP to analog based solution is it's really easy to implement, just in the sheer amount of equipment that would be necessary to start this particular solution. Whereas, in comparison to, say, an IP based solution where you got to set up speakers for all the different rooms, say horns for outdoors, horns for the gymnasium, a paging server with your whole schedule built in, that's a lot to set up. Whereas if you're dealing with an IP to analog solution and you're just getting, say, our paging adapter or our paging server to interface with that analog paging hardware, that's one device to set up instead of many. So it becomes much, much easier to actually implement in comparison to a more full-fledged digital or IP-based system. And the nice thing that you get when you're dealing with one of our IP to analog solution products is you get a very similar style of operation, because a lot of the times when you're dealing with these different amplifiers that can actually handle zoning via DTMF, that process doesn't change when you switch it over from an analog-based POT system, a regular phone system, over to a VoIP phone system. At the end of the day, you're still going to have to call some number, that being your CyberData device, and then enter some kind of a DTMF code to toggle one of those different zones. And the nice thing with sticking with an IP to analog solution, like one of our paging adapters or our paging servers, is you can set up the system to work virtually in the exact same manner as it did before you switched over to VoIP. For example, and for conversation's sake, say you dial 123 to call the paging system on your analog system. On most VoIP phone providers, you can set custom numbers for all the different extensions that you create. So you could create an extension for that paging adapter and that paging server that would be extension 123. So the people that actually operate and use the system dial that same exact number. You don't have to retrain the people. And that would just be to dial the particular paging device that you get to interface with that analog system. And then from that point on, everything that interfaces with that analog system, say to dial the outside zone or individual classrooms, would be exactly the same, because that's all controlled by the analog paging system, and that did not change with your migration. So by going with an IP to analog solution, you can really not only guarantee that you don't have to spend that much money, first and foremost, because you're only buying a single unit instead of many, but then you also don't have to invest that time and man hours into retraining the actual users of the system on how to use the new system. So it's, a really low financial investment to get the, ball rolling to move into this new system, and it's the path of least resistance, because you don't have to set up a whole bunch, you don't have to wait for a whole bunch of product to come, and you don't have to retrain people. So an IP to analog solution is probably the quickest option that you have to go to market. So for our IP to analog options, we've really got two main ones. There's one other one that I'm not going to cover today, our 4-port zone controller. But typically when you're dealing with an IP to analog paging solution, it's going to be either our SIP paging adapter, part number 011233, which is basically just your simple interface to an existing paging system. You want to pick up a phone, make an overhead announcement, whether that's a single zone announcement, which you probably wouldn't encounter in schools, or a multi-analog zone-based system that you would actually need to enter DTMF codes for that particular analog zone. You could do that pretty easily with the paging adapter. That's really what the paging adapter is designed for. Then you could also go for the SIP paging server, part number 011146, which is essentially, it's actually the exact same hardware as the paging adapter, but it's got a slightly different feature set on it, where that one can also interface with a paging system, but it's also got a bell scheduler built into it. So it's a little bit more versatile for paging systems, just because, especially at a school, it comes with the bell scheduler built into it, which is such an important thing for schools. Especially you get kids, they need to know when the class ends, and you can't expect the teachers or the aides to be able to, watch their watch the entire time and keep an eye on the time to let the students go to different classes. That needs to all be handled automatically by a bell scheduler. And if they need something like that, the paging server is the perfect option for that. However, sometimes when you're sticking with an IP to analog based solution, it's typically a entire paging solution that the school might have that might not only handle actually calling to the different classrooms via DTMF codes, but it might also have some kind of a bell scheduler that's already built into it. I know in the couple schools that I visited, they basically had this entire solution that essentially came with a full-fledged PC that they could use strictly to manage the particular paging system that they had, and all of their bell scheduling would be done on that particular computer. So in the instances that I've interacted with those particular setups, they went for the paging adapter because they just wanted the interface to the paging system, and they didn't need the bell scheduler. However, if they do need the bell scheduler, the paging adapter or the paging server is a great option. There are some subtle nuances and differences when you're dealing with the paging adapter to the paging server, meaning that the paging adapter it was actually designed to interface with a paging system and has the one key feature that you would want when you're dealing with an analog zone-based paging system, one that actually requires DTMF pass-through to toggle those particular zones, and that is DTMF menu for analog zone. And basically what that particular setting does is that enables a DTMF menu on the paging adapter that'll prompt you to enter a DTMF number that will be passed along through the paging adapter's physical outputs, both that tip and ring connection or the RCA style connection, and pass that on to the particular amplifier. That particular feature does not exist on the paging server. Therefore, the paging adapter is more versatile at connecting to amplifiers that handle that analog zoning. That doesn't mean the paging server cannot do that feature, but it's a little bit different to be frank, it's a little bit more inconvenient with the paging server because you have to select one of the 100 different multicast groups on the paging server, and then after that group is live, meaning that anything that you say or any buttons that you press will be sent out its analog connections, but also back across the network as multicast. That's when you have to enter that DTMF code to toggle those particular zones. It's a little cumbersome, and if you're doing a hybrid-based solution, like we'll cover momentarily, those beep tones will be sent through multicast and be picked up by all of the different IP-based devices while you're still trying to get that analog amplifier to actually pick up and actually play to that particular selected zone. So in those cases where you're dealing with an amplifier that actually requires that analog input, you're going to need the paging adapter, or the paging adapter would be better suited for that. So for our IP to analog solution, to kind of go over a broad idea of what the system will look like, you've basically got your paging adapter or your paging server, and that's going to interface with the different analog amplifiers that you can potentially use. And this would be either using the RCA line out connection, which is 10,000 ohm, high Z, unbalanced. That's used to connect to more modern amplifiers. To be honest, we don't use that connection as much as we do what we call the interface or the page port connection, which would be that green screw down terminal pictured here. Specifically, pins 3 and 4 are what will be used to actually connect to the amplifier, and that would be your pins, your tip and ring positive and negative. And those will connect to the different amplifier, and then the amplifier goes on to the existing speakers. And the nice thing with this is the connection is, of course, the same between both the paging adapter and the paging server, but it gives you all that capability that you would need to tie into that existing paging system with both connection options, as well as having a line-in input if you need to have any background music, or if you say you want to connect your handheld radio system to the paging solution, you could potentially do that. So you get a lot of capability with one of these units, and this is kind of the general idea of how this particular setup would work, where a call would come from either your on-prem PBX, either in the cloud or, of course, on-prem. It would traverse your network going through, maybe one PoE switch or multiple switches, and then finally onto the paging adapter, which would then transmit that audio from the IP-based packets that it'll receive into analog audio and out to the amplifier and on from there. So it gives you a really easy, simple solution that's got the quickest go-to-market option. So next we get to hybrid paging. So hybrid paging is, of course, a combination between your your IP to analog based system and an IP based system. So the nice thing with this is it's a fairly financially competitive option as compared to, say, a full-fledged IP-based system. You can use analog in some areas and IP-based in others. So that way, if, for example, like I said initially, you've got a kind of an older school building that's got the whole analog system that they got, a couple, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that still works, but they're starting to build a new section of the building, say that, they're building a different area for, say, kindergarten or something like that. And they could go with IP-based solutions in the newer area. While they're in there, they can just lay the CAT cables and then still utilize the the analog-based system in other areas. So that way you can kind of have a hybrid-based system and replace it as you go. One of the nice things that you get when you go with a hybrid-based system is it becomes very versatile, because instead of kind of being locked into the feature set when you buy it like you would be with an analog system, you can't really make any changes or add any new features to an analog system because analog hardware doesn't change. IP-based hardware that can get firmware updates can change. We can add new features in the future, either that we just come up with on our own, or we get different feature requests, and the system can change and adapt to new requirements that might come up in the paging scenario. So a hybrid-based system becomes very versatile and can really adapt to any particular changes. And the nice thing with a hybrid-based system is a hybrid-based system could literally be a paging adapter to interface with the majority of the paging system and one IP66 horn to, say, cover the blacktop where kids would go play at recess. It could be that simple where you've got two devices, and that could literally be a hybrid-based paging system. And you can upgrade as you go, where, especially if the particular school district that you're working with is a little strapped for cash, like a lot of school districts are finding themselves now, in our current times, where it might not be, they might not be financially capable to actually expand to a full IP-based system. So going with a hybrid-based system would allow them to expand over time. Say they upgrade a couple buildings at the start of the year and they do a little bit more over the winter holiday and then do the rest of it the following year. They could do it, every summer. They could add in a couple more areas that would be under an IP-based system. You get that capability to expand and convert to an IP-based at your own pace. So that way you're not kind of pushed or under the gun like you would be with a full IP-based system to get everything up and running and working from the get-go, because if you don't, then you don't have a paging system. So the hybrid is kind of the best of both worlds, where you get that kind of, frankly, cheap and, easy to implement option of analog paired with the more versatile IP-based solution. So when you're dealing with a hybrid-based solution, you're, of course, going to have two main product categories. You're going to have your IP to analog interface, so something to exist with that existing analog amplifier setup. So that could be either your paging server or your paging adapter, depending on the particular application and the requirements. Typically, if you're going to be dealing with this hybrid-based system, we would usually recommend a paging server, because of the capability to not only interface with that analog amplifier, but also send any of those calls or notifications back across the network as multicast to all those other IP-based endpoints. However, if you go with something like a paging adapter, and you've got a platform that has a different, say, style of paging extensions, for an example, with Ring Central, you could have that capability to build in a hybrid paging system without that paging server to be able to page to all those different IP endpoints. With Ring Central, you can have the paging devices, and you can create all these different groups through Ring Central. So that way you have that capability to do the zoning all ingrained in the Ring Central system, and you don't need our hardware to do it. So it can be really important to really understand all of the capabilities of that particular phone system and the requirements of the paging system, so that way you can pick the best IP to analog hardware to fit that particular solution. No two solutions are exactly the same, so it's always good to do your due diligence and know everything, all the features in and out of that particular phone system and the requirements of the end location where all this hardware is going to be going. Next, we get to the IP paging solutions or equipment that you'll be using during your actual paging capability. And that could be either our SIP speakers, part number 011394, our multicast speakers, either in a ceiling mount or a wall mount, ceiling mount being 011458, and the wall mount being 011487. Or finally, and of course my favorite product here at CyberData, are SIP IP66 horns, and that would be part number 011457. So the nice way that you can get this whole system to work is, of course, you'll have your IP to analog interface, whichever product you end up picking for that particular category, and then you'll have your IP paging endpoints all across the rest of the area where you need that IP-based solution, say in that new building or maybe on the exterior. You've got a lot of different places to put them, and you've got a lot of options there. So our standard SIP speakers can either potentially be used in a full SIP style mode, or you can actually call the IP address of the particular speaker itself and have that full, assuming you get the talkback version, you could have a full duplex conversation or just make a one-way announcement if you get the standard SIP speaker. So it gives you a lot of capability to page to individual classrooms, maybe a common area, or even, say, a cafeteria. They wouldn't really be ideal for a cafeteria because of the noise requirements and the size of that particular area, but you could, of course, implement that there and say a portion of the cafeteria, maybe in the lunch area where students get in a queue and pick out whatever lunch items they want, and they go and actually pay, assuming schools still do that. They did that when I was a kid. But you've also got other options, say like our multicast speaker options. These are newer products that we have with CyberData. We've already covered these in another edition of CyberSchool, but these are multicasts only speakers. So they're really easy to tie into a multicast-based paging system, maybe that you might be using, say, with our SIP paging server, which would give you the capability to page to 100 different multicast groups. And these multicast speakers can be the recipients in one of these different groups. I like these speakers as filler speakers because you don't have the individual addressability that you would get like you would with a standard SIP speaker, that you could just call the dedicated extension of the SIP speaker and be able to call to, say, that particular classroom. You can't really do that with the multicast speakers just because they don't support SIP. There's other ways to do that through multicast, but that's kind of outside of the scope of this particular training session. So that's why I really recommend the multicast speakers as filler speakers, because they're great to be in those different multicast groups to pick up that multicast to be able to make the announcement in given areas. Good places for applications for these particular speakers could be hallways, say maybe outside of a classroom where students might gather in passing periods, or maybe areas if they have indoor lockers. That could be a great area just to get an announcement out to those students in those areas. But then you'll get other kind of bigger common areas, maybe say like a games room, or a cafeteria, or other places where you'll have a large congregation of students, and you don't really necessarily need that individual addressability that you would get with a SIP speaker. The multicast speakers are perfect for that. It basically any place where you need an announcement to be heard, but you don't need that individual addressability. So it gives you a lot of capability and flexibility with those. And then finally, we move on to the IP66 horns, which are really versatile for any environment where you need one-way paging and you need it to be loud. Of course, our SIP speakers and even our multicast speakers are pretty loud, but at the end of the day, they're speakers, where a horn is just going to be so much louder because of the design of the particular device, where horns are just designed from the ground up at being louder, as compared to a speaker that's designed for more intelligibility. Not to say that our IP66 horns or any of our horns in general aren't easy to understand, but they're designed at first and foremost to be loud, and then the intelligibility is kind of the second best part. You just want to make sure that the page is actually heard. And the IP66 horns are perfect for just about any application in a school, whether that's indoors or outdoors. Say indoors in a cafeteria, in a gymnasium, kind of any large area where you really want to get an announcement out, and it could be a loud area like you'd get, say, if a food fight breaks out in a cafeteria, or in a gymnasium, say if kids are playing dodgeball because it's raining and they're all inside. You'd really want something that could be loud, that could be heard over, the chatter and, the loudness of students. You'd really want something loud, and that's where the IP66 horn could come in. And the nice thing that these things are IP66 rated, so of course, I've really only talked about indoor applications for them, but they're IP66 rated, so they can go outdoors. So they could be perfect if you're dealing with an elementary school where kids actually still attend recess, and they can go out and play on the blacktop, or maybe even go play on the jungle gym or swing on the swing set. And with the IP66 capability of these horns, you can put them outside. So that way, even if the students are out on the blacktop and they're out playing and they're not, say, in a classroom where it would be really easy to get that announcement out to them, with an IP66 horn, you can mount it outside and those kids will be able to hear it out there on the blacktop, no problem. So this really kind of designs the hybrid paging solution where you can integrate both possible options, the IP to analog as well as standard IP-based paging endpoints. So to kind of give an idea of how this system would work, it's going to work very similar as compared to kind of a standard, the system that we showed in the last slide, very similar to the IP to analog solution, but just done up a little bit more. Whereas the paging server in this particular application would connect to an amplifier and be able to pass any audio that it receives, of course, out its physical connections back to the amplifier, but then it could send the multicast traffic back across the network to all the different other IP devices you have, since this is kind of a hybrid-based solution. So that way, all of the audio can not only cover that IP to analog section, but it can also be sent back across the network to all of those different smart IP-based devices, your SIP speakers, your IP66 horns, even your intercoms if you went for that route. Of course, the message can't be played at the call button because the call button doesn't have a speaker, so it can't make any noise, but you sure as heck could go and make an announcement actually from the push button. Those are really useful in certain scenarios. I'd really recommend most schools that go for an IP-based solution to consider these panic buttons. They can be extremely useful as you get, say probably not as useful in, say, a kindergarten where you might not need discrete assistance, but when you get into kind of schools with older kids, you're dealing with a middle school or a high school. Unfortunately, sometimes these kids can get a little agitated, and say in a counselor's office, vice principal, or the principal's office, kids don't always take bad news, especially if they're getting suspended for a week, very well. So sometimes having a discrete call button mounted underneath the desk in, say, a vice principal's office can be very helpful if a student gets a little agitated when they find out that they're going to get suspended for getting in a fight. that can be kind of helpful. And the nice thing with these SIP call buttons is they can have a particular audio file loaded directly on the unit. And then when the button is pressed, it can either send a multicast announcement back across the network to hit all of those devices in your hybrid-based system, but they can also make a call to a particular number. So if it was anything like my high school or my middle school, there was a school resource officer, actually a police officer that was on campus at all times. It could potentially go to their cell phone, or if they have a desk, it could go directly to their desk. So that way the school resource officer could potentially be dispatched to that particular office where the student is a little disgruntled after finding out some bad news about their suspension or maybe even expulsion, depending on what that particular hypothetical student did. Okay, so for an IP-based solution, this really ends up being the most versatile option. It becomes the most versatile because everything's going to be IP-based and SIP-based, and kind of like we learned about in your hybrid-based system, your IP-based devices can update over time, meaning that they can have different firmware version. They can, the firmware can be iterated on, and that can of course fix bugs, but it can also add additional features. So a completely IP-based system is the most versatile because it can expand and adapt to changes and requirements with the solution in that particular implementation. And the nice thing that you get when you go with an IP-based system is it ends up being fairly future-proof. Probably like how the original paging system that, we're going in there and replacing was sold to the schools, maybe 20, 30 years ago. Oh, this will be future-proof. It's 1990. Nobody's going to come out with an internet-based phone system. Internet's just for, sharing files. Well, who would have thought that we had IP-based solutions? But for the foreseeable future, an IP-based solution today, if you get one, would be future-proof as you move forward and look towards the next 10, 15 years of your system. It's more than likely going to be a SIP-based phone system. So that makes the system very future-proof and can expand not only with the current system that you might implement, say if you're working with one provider and 5 or 6 years down the line and you switch to a different provider because they can do a better rate for you, the system will likely work on that, assuming that they're still doing SIP in the future. That doesn't seem to be changing, but it really makes the feature very very future-proof. The other nice thing that you get with an IP-based system is it becomes very reliable and easy to troubleshoot and manage remotely because it's all IP-based. Any good network manager or network admin can go and have different equipment on their network to be able to monitor and keep track of all of the hardware that they have available at that particular location. And the nice thing with something that's IP-based is it can be troubleshooted from just about anywhere in the world, which is why you see so many big corporations now having outside-based tech support. They don't necessarily need an internal network engineer, and they can outsource that because it's so easy for people to remote into a network to be able to make an announcement or make changes to a particular device. They can really be managed anywhere in the world, which makes the IP-based system extremely reliable in comparison to, say, an analog-based system. Whereas if an analog-based system goes down, or a teacher is prepping their classroom to get ready for the next year, and they're happening to hammer in a couple posters, and they hit one of the copper lines that are going through to hit the speaker, and that speaker's wired together for the next 10 classrooms, a single nail could take down a whole paging system. Whereas when you're dealing with something that would be IP-based, since every device is going to have their own Cat5 cable, you couldn't potentially go and knock out a whole bunch of classrooms. You would definitely only take out a single classroom in that particular scenario. However, that would be easily noticeable by the system because that one speaker that was registering on the phone system is now no longer registering, and it's not on the network, it's not at that particular IP address, so that way you're able to target that particular area and resolve the problem in a quick and timely manner. The other nice thing that we kind of covered in that whole little thing is the system is very adaptable to any new requirements that might come up, mainly because the devices are IP-based. So they can kind of adapt and change with the current system and their current requirements as they evolve. So, of course, when you're dealing with an analog-based system, you're kind of locked in. Once you buy the system, you can't really go and change what that particular speaker can do after you go and install it. Whereas with an IP-based system, because everything can get a firmware update, we can add new features to it. Say, for example, if you go with a standard SIP-based system, and then a few years down the line, you end up moving to, say, an Informacast-based emergency paging system. Informacast, for any of those that didn't watch our CyberSchool all about that, is an emergency notification software suite designed specifically for schools and large enterprise companies. Perhaps a end customer would want to switch over to that particular system. Well, that can be very easily done with IP-based hardware that might not be possible to do with an analog-based solution. So you can really adapt to new requirements, whether that would be just a subtle firmware change on the particular device or even adapting and using a wholly new paging system. But the one kind of downside that you'll encounter with an IP-based solution is that it can be, frankly, kind of expensive to go and roll out an entire IP-based solution to, say, an entire school. Say you've got a decent-sized, elementary school or a middle school that might have 30 or 40 classrooms and, a whole bunch of common areas, a big gymnasium, a big cafeteria. You could be dealing with, probably 100, if not more, SIP speakers. And those SIP speakers aren't cheap. So that could be, a decent financial barrier to get over before you can actually start using that IP-based system. That is one of the key concerns and one of the reasons that we get people that end up being hesitant to go and move over to a wholly IP-based paging solution. And that's understandable because, to be frank, it can be kind of expensive to move over to that. But you have to consider the system down the line and not just think in the moment, yeah, okay, this is going to cost maybe, $80,000 to go and implement this. Well, if it costs $80,000 to implement, and then the next couple of years, we don't have to have any boots on the ground to, say, replace a speaker or do new wire runs, the cost will decrease over the next couple of years, as you won't have to have techs come out to site and work on different things after the system is implemented. So it can be a high upfront cost and then a very low cost across the board as you continue to use the system in the years after the upgrade. And one of the nice things that you get is, when you're dealing with an IP-based system, you don't have to, say, send a tech out to site and then be kind of limited at the availability of that particular, say, installing company or the tech that would go out to site that might not be available for a week or two. If you're dealing with an IP-based solution, they can remote into the system and potentially fix the problem in minutes as compared to getting an appointment to have a tech come out in 2 weeks. So there's really definitely a cost and benefit that you have to weigh when you're picking a particular paging solution, whether you go for, say, a hybrid-based solution, an IP to analog-based solution, or a full IP-based solution. But with an IP-based solution, you're really going to be limited to, especially if you're IP to analog based system, especially if you're not going to have, say, an analog amplifier for any areas, you wouldn't need our SIP paging adapter, again, because that one's designed to interface with an existing paging system. You could use the paging server, which could effectively become the head of your paging system, where all calls to the paging system, whether you need to make that general all-page announcement to the entire school or, say, to individual grades, you could do all of that through the paging server utilizing multicast. Then you get to your paging endpoints. And these are a lot of the endpoints that we covered in the prior slide for our hybrid solution, but there's also a couple others in here, mainly being our loudspeaker amplifier combination, which is either part number 011404 or part number 011405, either for the PoE-based variant or the AC power variant, as well as our SIP strobes, either part number 011376 or part number 011479 for the indoor-outdoor variant. When you're dealing with a wholly IP-based system, especially if you're going to have that SIP paging server in there to send the multicast out to all of the different endpoints, is you get a really versatile system that you can have the direct communication capability that you get with, say, the SIP speakers. You can get the kind of filler speakers with the multicast speakers, and then you can get the indoor-outdoor loud paging with your IP66 horns, your loudspeaker amplifiers, depending on the application. The IP66 horns can be a little bit pricey, so those might be better for, say, a gymnasium or a cafeteria Whereas if you're going to be putting something outside that can be exposed to the elements, maybe a loudspeaker amplifier would be a better option. You could keep the loudspeaker amplifier itself internally to the building and just run a cable outside to use that particular analog horn outside, especially maybe towards a blacktop in a middle school where you'll get kids playing ball, and you'll get some pesky teenagers that are always trying to throw their dodgeball when the PE teacher isn't looking at that particular horn and maybe damage the horn. I'd really rather damage a $70 analog horn instead of a $500 IP-based horn. So you've got a lot of different options as you're adding these different IP paging endpoints. And then, of course, we'd be doing a disservice talking about an IP paging system if we didn't cover visual notification. Visual notification is just so important when you're dealing with an IP-based paging system, because there will be areas that will be a little loud. Say, for example, in that cafeteria where you've got a food fight going on and you've got all these kids, being loud and laughing and cheering as they're, throwing their milk cartons and their, bean burritos through the air, throwing them at different yard duties or their school rivals or anything like that. Well, when that announcement comes out from the principal that says, hey, everybody lock down, you're all in trouble, everybody's getting a detention, the students might not pay attention to that paging system that's going off, but they'll definitely see that big blinky light on the wall, and that might get a couple students to quiet down so that way they can hear, oh, you've all got a detention, or, you're all suspended, or, whatever punishment these school administrators would want to divvy out. But you get a lot more capability and a lot more, there's really no hindrance to what particular endpoints you could utilize in a wholly IP-based paging system. So to talk a little bit more about a broad paging solution to kind of finally cement the ideas of the different paging options that you could implement and kind of give an idea to where all these different products would go, is we've got one of our great cut sheets that we have available on our website that I thought was absolutely perfect to kind of go and illustrate this particular solution. So again, starting from the left-hand side here, our paging server is really going to be the head of the entire paging solution for this particular school, because it's going to handle the announcements as well as the bells that are all handled just by making a dedicated SIP call to the paging server, and that can transmit the multicast back across the network to all the different endpoints. But it really becomes the head unit again, because it's going to be your bell scheduler. It can do automated announcements and live announcements. Then for areas like classrooms, as we move towards the top of the image here, we've got our SIP speaker that's placed in a clock kit. And that gives a lot of capability for making pages and different announcements, because you've got that auditory notification, and if you opt for the talkback variant, you get a full duplex communication as well as having a clock in the classroom. I know when I was a kid, we still had analog clocks in the classrooms, but sometimes the digital clocks are nice for certain instances, and you get that capability with one of our SIP speakers. Then as we move towards the center of the image here, we've got the ceiling mount multicast speaker that you could utilize in hallways. Again, because those are areas that wouldn't need to be individually addressable. They'd be treated kind of as an all page or that particular wing of the school, where they could pick up multicast and just play that general announcement, where you wouldn't say need to call the particular speaker that's in the hallway just outside of the cafeteria. So it'd be a really great option to just kind of do that paging coverage area. As we move towards the right-hand side, you could easily integrate one of our intercoms. This option shows an intercom with RFID for one of the exits to the building. So that way, say the janitorial staff or yard duties can move around the exterior of the building and still be able to get through using one of their RFID cards to actually just scan and be able to grant themselves access without having to call, say, the front office or a secretary to be able to buzz them in. As we move towards the far right side here, we've got our SIP call button, which is ideal for different areas, again, kind of like we talked about, for being more that emergency or that panic button. Say if you've got, a big cafeteria and that food fight happens to break out, or you could have a couple of these call buttons in different areas, maybe where your yard duties or your yard supervisors could just quickly walk over and press that help button that could have some predetermined message in there that could say, call the front office and alert them that there's a problem going on in the cafeteria. It could be in a little bit more discreet offices, maybe where the cooks or the lunch ladies or lunch people might actually go and prepare the food for the students. It could be maybe one of those areas, say if there's a fire or something breaks out in there. Gives you a lot of capability for that emergency notification. And then finally, as we move back towards our center here, we've got our IP66 horn that's versatile for paging, both in our gymnasium there, as well as on the exterior of the building. So that way you can make these good announcements to anywhere and ensure that they're going to be heard, because that horn is loud. And then finally, you've got, as we move back towards the center here, the lower center, we've got our strobe options. Now we've got our outdoor strobe pictured just outside of the facility. That one's going to be perfect since it's going to be exposed to the elements there. And with the nice IP rating that you get with our outdoor rated strobe, it's going to be perfect for any of those applications and will withstand up to the usual elements that you would expect from the post office, whether it's rain, sleet, snow, water, coronavirus, what have you. That strobe's going to be just fine outdoors. Then, of course, when you're dealing with an indoor environment, you really don't need that ruggedized case and that full IP-based protection, so you can use one of our indoor strobes and still get that full alerting capability and that visual notification that can be just so important when you're dealing with an overall paging system. So this diagram really kind of gives you an idea of how all of these different parts and pieces fit together and their different applications, whereas you've got your standard SIP speakers in classrooms, you've got your IP66 horn in areas where you'll need a little bit more loudness, as well as multicast speakers where that loudness isn't important, nor is that individual addressability, and you can go for those in hallways to be able to save a little bit of money. So it gives you a good idea of the applications of these different products. So at the end of the day, which option is right? Well, to be honest, it really kind of depends on the requirements of the particular paging system. It might not be capable, the existing analog infrastructure might not be capable to provide the new requirements of the paging system. So that might completely rule out an IP to analog based option. It really kind of depends on the expectations and the requirements of that particular paging system to be able to get an idea if whether an IP to analog, hybrid, or IP-based solution is going to be right. Again, it really kind of depends on the particular implementation, and there's no set solution that'll work for every site. Every site is going to have their own individual problem, and as such, there's going to be a solution for each particular implementation. IP to analog is, of course, going to be the easiest option and the quickest path to market, because instead of having to set up many devices, you typically only have to set up one device. So that's really going to be the easiest option in terms of implementation, not only from a setup process, but also a financial investment option. If you're looking for just the bare bones, I just got to keep this analog paging system limping along, an IP to analog might be the right way to go. But if you need a little bit more flexibility, an IP-based or a hybrid-based system will give you that flexibility. If you need more capability to say expand in the future, or add in additional feature sets, a hybrid-based or an IP-based system will give you the most flexibility there. Of course, the IP-based solution is going to be the most flexible, but it's also pretty expensive to start. It's going to have that high startup cost where it's going to cost a decent chunk of money to actually get the whole system started and up and running. But after it's up and running, there's going to be very little money that'll need to be invested in the system for the coming years, because it'll be very easy to troubleshoot and manage remotely. All of that can be outsourced or be handled internally, and it's something that problems can be identified almost nearly immediately, depending on the reporting capabilities of the system and how it's all configured. So there's a lot of different options when you're considering a school paging solution. And again, to really just kind of sum it all up, it depends on the requirements of that particular implementation. There's not going to be just one particular solution that we could recommend, and we want to give as many potential options as possible as people are trying to spec out different options when they're trying to interface and provide a school paging solution.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.